All right, so with all that said, let's jump into Chapter 6. All right, how to script the DOM with JavaScript. And they mention, you know a lot more than you probably even imagine that you know right now. It says you need to learn how to use some of the properties and methods provided by the DOM specs, as well as some special skills. If you're looking through this, and what I'm going to spend the most time on here are the actual applications. All right, I'm not going to spend virtually any time on the page on the left that's got all this stuff, because this is what we just went over. All right, I want to spend some time on what's in here. That's why I said the chapter may not take that long to go through, because I spent a long time on the other stuff. So they're saying that if you build this, the DOM gets created like this. All right, and you don't have to worry that the shapes are different, etc. All right, or the colors are different. What they're trying to show you is this is the stuff that gets set up for you when you create a web page. It's not every web page, it's this web page. So as simple really as this web page is, you can see the DOM for it is fairly complex. All right, so here as it says, the nodes that you'll commonly use. We looked at the document node. We looked at the element node. ATTR is attribute. So we looked at some of the stuff with attributes, and we looked at how you can change, add, delete text. So we've looked at this stuff already. So again, this is just meant to kind of crystallize what we just went over. So the Muroc here defines the DOM as a hierarchical collection of nodes that represents the current page. It says to modify it, you can use the properties and methods that are defined in the DOM core specification. There are a bunch in this chapter. There are a bunch of tables like this. We looked at some of these examples. By no means did we look at every example that was in here. All right? But when you start going through there, they have examples. All right? And as it says in there, notice, parent node, child node. Notice all these return something. So when we look at parent node, child node, first child, last child, and next element sibling, it says returns a node object if one exists. All right? And again, then there are some examples. All right. When DOM scripting, you often use the properties of the node interface. So we've already looked at query selector in an earlier chapter. When we went over the stuff in W3 schools, we did some looking at query selector all. Again, the difference, query selector just returns the first element that matches what you're looking for, and it goes in a forward direction when it's searching. Query selector all, as it says, returns all elements that match what you pass to it. All right? Once you do that, here's some common elements. We did not go over most of these. All right? But again, I would strongly recommend that when you are taking the test on this next week, you have, if you've got a hard copy of this, have it open to this chapter. If you've got an electronic copy of it, open up the electronic copy and have that W3 schools thing that we just went over. So notice how to get an array of all the list items within a certain UL. And again, why would you want to do that? You would be able to, if you wanted to or needed to either manipulate those, change those, add things to them, remove things from them, etc. And when you start thinking about it, let's just pretend for a second that you wrote a web page, and on that web page you had an interactive test for people. Maybe you were testing them on this stuff, and you would ask them questions. All right, and if you know that it might be a tough test where you've got A, B, C, D, and E, and more than one answer can be correct. So you could fill that in. So if they got one wrong, you could show it the one they got wrong and put it in red. If they forgot one, you could show it and put it in green, as an example. So as it says, the methods of the document and element interfaces return objects that represent elements. And you can use them to work with attributes as well. Now, what it says here, the properties of the DOM spec You can go out to the DOM spec here. It's not very exciting reading. It's a technical document. But notice it's W3.org. That is the World Wide Web Consortium. They're the people who basically give you W3 schools. All right, and also notice it's DOM level 2, which means there was a DOM level 1. So this is a living kind of document as time goes on. And the idea is to give programmers more and more power when they're doing this, and to provide more and more built-in functionality so they don't have to write their own stuff. They can call existing stuff. All right. So as it says here, here's some of the properties that are typically available to you. So everybody has got an ID, a title, and a class name. All right. Now, when they say it's available to all, if you don't set up an ID, of course it doesn't have one, but potentially at least. Anchor tags have an href. Images have both a source and an alt. When you think about it, these pretty much here are kind of like your built-ins, for lack of better words. And they show you how you can use them. So notice here, that would allow us to select all anchor links. Once we did that, we could grab just the ID of the first one. So again, it's returning a node collection, but we can treat it as though it's an array. And this right here, as it says, this is the DOM specification. But then what happened was they came up, and there are always more than one way of doing the same thing. So when you look at this, sometimes when you go and look at a chart, there'll be a way to do it using the DOM spec and another way you can do it using the HTML spec. Why would they do that? Because somebody has decided that there was an easier way of doing it than the way we were doing it, but both ways would work. So they talk here about this DOM token list, and there's some of the stuff that gets provided in here. Again, it's not that important that you realize, recognize, memorize any terminology. And most of the stuff that you're doing in here, I believe, at least on your test, will be pretty straightforward as far as what you're being asked to do. So as it says, this class list property gets an object that contains the classes an element is assigned to. Then you can use the associated properties and methods to work with them. So this FAQ application, we've seen things like this before. All right, and there are a multiple number of ways of writing this. But the idea is that when you click on this, this was a plus sign, it was black, and it said, what is jQuery? And there was nothing underneath it. When you clicked on it, the verbiage became blue, it went from a plus to a minus, and it showed you this. You can set it up so that one is always open, all right? You can have multiple be open however you want. Okay? So the HTML is nothing we haven't seen before. That's nothing big. The CSS is really not big. You should be able to read both of those and it should make sense. What's new in here is some of this JavaScript. So let's take a bit and go through it. Notice const toggle equal event followed by a fat arrow or an arrow function. All right? That's the event. When you toggle something, you're clicking to turn it on, and you're clicking again to turn it off. And that's what they're talking about in here. All right? So you're toggling, in this case, between a minus and a plus, which is the minus and the open. All right? So you know what the prevent default is because we've already talked about that. If we're setting it up as a hyperlink, we don't want it to go anywhere. That's not opening up a new link, it's opening up a new area of text that's down below where we currently are. So that's why we're using the prevent default. Then we're adding an event listener here. And notice we're grabbing all of the H2 tags and we're putting it into a constant that's called H2 elements. Then we are iterating, I should say, not iterating, iterating our way through here, And we're basically saying, when you add your way through here, all right, set this toggle mechanism that we showed up above anytime somebody clicks, all right, the element. And then when we first start, we're going to have it be on the first one. All right. Now, I don't know if that was a good explanation or a bad one. It was an explanation. But you can read the associated text in here. All right. Again, where a lot of this stuff is important is in scripting forms and doing form validation. So this I will take a second. It says the figure on the next page shows a form with 3 controls, 2 text boxes and a button. All right. It says to start with, you do the form element on the opening tag, you add the action and the method attributes. Again, when you take the AWD 1111 class in fall of next year and you click a button, a submit button on a form, you're going to be sending it to where you want it to go. We start by just having you use your computer as both a client and a server. So it's basically you're mocking it, but after a while we throw the stuff out on the internet. And then literally you're able to communicate, all right, and when you click a button, you're able to have it go out to the internet and do something. All right, we've talked about get and we've talked about post before. When you typically do a get, you're showing something. You're presenting something to the user. So if I do a get, I might show you a form. When you click submit, that's going to be a post, because then you're attempting to send information usually out to a server. Now, with that post request as opposed to a get, we've talked about this before. If you look up on the screen right here, this is not a good example, but it's the one I'm going to use. All right, I'm at platform.verdocs.com, but in a true web address, the stuff that you see here in blue would have question mark and a bunch of stuff after it. That's referred to as the query string. That would be a get. That shows information. But if you are asking somebody for information that could be considered sensitive in nature, passwords, credit cards are the best known ones, you would always do it using a post, because it doesn't show that information here. Rather, it shows it in the headers, all right, that are not shown to the public, so to speak. Now, if you know what you're doing, you can dig through and sometimes find that information. It is amazing, and it's people who are a lot smarter than I am and know a lot more about this than I do, but that you can go in and get information. All right, when I worked at technical colleges in Wisconsin, probably for about 10 years in a row, in March we would always have a conference where all the instructors got together. I could never understand that because they had it in northern Wisconsin at the beginning of March. There were times I went up there during snowstorms. All right, but the point is, there was a guy named Joe something or other who taught in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and he lived for this stuff. And what he did was he started scraping websites, and it was amazing stuff that was left out there that wasn't supposed to be. He could literally find people's names. He could find their credit card numbers. He could find their histories of what they bought, etc. I mean, he knew what the heck he was doing. He knew more than, if you had a room of 1,000 people, there might have been 1 or 2 who knew what he knew. All right. But they explain the whole concept of what's happening in here. All right. So there's the action, there's the method. That's just bringing this up. All right. Now, as it says, this is what's going to be sent. Now, this could be sent, in this case, I think you'd agree, this could be sent using a get. There's nothing in here that is, oh, so somebody found out their name. Well, it's an email address, but it's just a first name. They wouldn't be able to put a whole name with it. All right. And again, there's the query string that we talked about before. The query string is what happens after the question mark. So the query string there, is we've got a field called the key value pairs. So the key is email address, the value is Grace. All right, the key is, or Grace at yahoo.com. The key is first name, the value is Grace here, okay? And again, we've talked about this before. All right, we've worked with text boxes. We've worked with text areas before. And they all have values. Remember how we've been using that value property? All right, that's what you stick in there. Okay, so you can grab that. And here's some examples of that. We've looked at this kind of stuff before. All right, and remember, there's a difference between if they're on the right-hand side or the left-hand side of an equal sign. If they're on the right-hand side of an equal sign, you're using them as what's called a getter. You're grabbing that information and you're copying it into a variable. If you're not using an equal sign, or if it's on the left-hand side of an equal sign, like here you're setting it. So this is, you should know this by now. This is going to go through your HTML. It's going to find something with the ID of country, and it's going to set it equal to nothing. All right? On the other hand, this is going the other way. This is grabbing whatever was in that ID of country. It's grabbing its value, and it's assigning it to a variable named country. And again, who cares? Well, country is one thing, but think about if it was state. Different states have different taxing, the way they tax stuff, etc. Different countries have different ways they tax stuff. Maybe if this is Amazon and they're sending something out to India, maybe there's some special charge that we wouldn't have here in the United States, as an example. So as they say here, the name and ID fields of the controls should be set to the same value. The ID is what we use in this class. Everything we've done, if you leave off the name property in this class, it wouldn't matter. The stuff that we're doing in the other class in the afternoon, 99 times out of 100, if they didn't put an ID in, but they put a name in, it wouldn't matter. All right? All right. Radio buttons and checkboxes are a little different. They have a checked property to tell whether or not it's been checked or selected, whatever. It says the contents, this returns a string. But if you just want to see, have I checked? Did you check, male or female for gender? You'd be checking the checked property. All right? And again, there's how we're checking it. All right, no pun intended there. So all radio buttons in a group must have the same name, but each one must have a different ID. So if I made a radio button group that was called gender, because today, we've got, I can't tell you what everything in LGBTQ stands for. Right? I know most of it probably. All right, but the point is, you could have in there male, female, transitioning, other, etc. You could have all that stuff in there. All right, and if we made that a group, we'd call the name property would be called gender, but each ID would be different. Almost always, we've talked about this before, the name property and the ID property are the same. Here's one time they must be different. So, as it says, two methods that are commonly used with forms. We don't typically worry a lot about the reset, because if you set the type to reset, it's built right in. It sets everything back to their default values. Now, if you want something different to happen, so if we do this, if I come through here and I say input type equal lowercase reset, and I'm out of room, so I'm just going to keep on the next line, and then I say, let's say name equal reset, and I say ID equal reset. Technically, I don't even need either one of these in there, but if I do that, and there's my form, and I've got a bunch of stuff on here, and I've got a button here that says reset, I don't have to code anything. It's going to set, when I click that, all these will be set back to their default values. But if I want something different to happen, are you with me? So I want something different, then I would come in here and do this. I wouldn't say type equal reset. I would come in here and do this. I would say button and I wouldn't give it a type, I'd say ID equal reset, name equal reset, and then I could put my own code in there if I wanted to do that. Now, typically you don't do that. It's not that you can't, but typically you don't. But on the other hand, for submit, we have just been so far kind of taking for granted that when you click submit, whatever's supposed to happen is going to happen. All right, but that's always assuming that the person running the program has a clue as to what they're doing, which may be a good assumption, it may not be a good assumption. All right? We've talked about these events. I'm not going to bore you with them because we've talked about them already. All right, but you can add code to any of these events. I already mentioned, I will mention these again, that if I'm going from one field to another on a form, so if I'm in form field 1 and I go to form field 2, 2 events happen. A blur from form field 1 and a focus for form field 2. But I can write code in there that checks and says, hey, if what you put in form field 1 is bad, I can force you right back into form field 1 with code. All right? That's pretty much what they're talking about in here. All right. So now there's another one. There's a register application. Again, when you look at this, it's more complex than the ones we've looked at earlier. And you can already tell. So you can look in here and basically everything is required. Does that make sense? And when you look at it, email right now is required, but you'd probably also be doing something to validate that it was a valid email. All right? One of the things we're going to look at in a later chapter is something that's called regular expression handling. And you can write what's called a regular expression handler for this to make sure that they've actually put the email in a suitable email form. Same thing with phone. Okay? Country, well, if it says select country, you didn't select one. Does that make sense? All right, we talked about that. I showed you an example where we had please select state in the form we had done earlier. All right? Now, if we've talked about this before, but if you come in here and you set one of these when you first create the form, let's just say we use text like they did. So when you create that one, you put the word checked there. The advantage of doing that is since one is checked, one will always be checked. And it's the default. If you don't select any of them, then you probably will have to put in code here that says you must select an option. Now, if somebody doesn't look at what they're doing, they're going to be contacted by text. All right? And here, we're just forcing them with this. They have to accept. You've all seen things like this. You have to agree to the terms of service, where you're basically signing your life away. All right? So when we look at this, again, I think you could build this form. Yeah, it's a little more complex than what we've done, but I think you could build it with no problem. All right? But what's new here is the JavaScript that they're using to validate this form. It's much more extensive than anything we've done before. All right? Now, this is a pattern that's quite often used when you look here. You've got a global Boolean variable that's called isValid, and you set it to true. Then you work your way through here, and if anything is found to be out of the ordinary, all right, then you set that variable to false. It already might be false, and you set it to false again. And the reason that you've got to do it like this is, looking back at this, I know you all know this already, you've got no idea when somebody fills out this form that they're always going to go from top to bottom. All right? Could you force them? You probably could by putting them here, and then if they moved off of there, basically just using a blur event to check and putting them back there again. I don't know if you'd want to do that. All right? That'd be pretty obtrusive to do something like that, but you probably could. All right? So you're coming through here. First, you're validating the email. If it's all they're checking is it empty? And if it's empty, they're going to put the error message there. Now look at what they've got there. Email, as you'd guess, that's called email, that's called phone, that's called country. All those make sense? This is probably called contact and terms or something like that. So what we're checking in here is not is it a valid email, etc., but is there a value in there? So I could put Jeff in there for the email, and I guess it would take that. All right? But this thing, email.nextElementSibling.text content, that is a div that by default is either going to be blank or maybe it'll have an asterisk here when you run this to show that it's a required field. Does that make sense? So one of the ways that you can access that is by what they're showing here. The next element over, which is a sibling, so it's got the same parent, and the content that you put in there. All right? And then they do the same thing for the phone, the country value, all right? And if you notice in here, that says if it's empty, that's not really a good check. Because that country, you shouldn't be checking to see if the value's empty. You should be checking to see if the country says select a country. All right? So I don't know if that was a mistake on their part or not. I think they're just showing a generic way to work your way through this. If you haven't checked for the terms, again, must be checked. So the bottom line is this. At the bottom here, this is valid, is going to be true if you met all the criteria, and it's going to be false if one or more of the criteria were not met. All right? So you're saying only if it's true, and again, that should be triple equals, do you call form.submit. All right? Otherwise, they should already know there was an error, and you even let them know what the error was. All right. When you reset, what are we doing? This is getting rid of and replacing any error messages with just the red asterisk, probably red. And this right here, remember this, what are we doing here? This says when the document has been loaded, we're adding our event listers. So we're saying when you click the register button, call process entries. When you click the reset button, call reset form, and make sure that when the program starts, you got the focus there. Does that all make sense? All right. I mean, when you look at it that way, at least in my opinion, it does make sense because well, that's how I do it. Yeah. But again, you got to realize that when you're working with this stuff, it's stupid. All right. And I said this once to people, and they didn't like it. They took it as I was offending them. But I said, the computer is only as smart as the person who is operating it. It can only do what you tell it to do. And if you don't tell it to do something, typically, unless you're working with AI or something, all right, it's not smart enough to know, oh, you didn't say this, but you meant to do it. All right? All right, so modifying the DOM then. Notice to create new elements and create new text nodes. Now you know what a text node is, or hopefully you do. And notice there's an append child, which sticks it on there as it says. There's an insert before, there's a replace, there's a remove. Notice the difference between remove child, all right, and remove itself. It says for remove child, it says removes the specified child node from the parent. But technically it still exists. It's just not linked to the parent, so you don't see it. But a remove removes the node completely. It says currently supported only by major browsers. All right? And again, they've got an example here where when you click the Add to DOM button, it goes in and it inserts basically, it does an insert after the first paragraph and it puts in middle paragraph. All right? All right, then they update the register application. Now, notice what they're doing. They have moved all the error messages to the top. All right? And they've let you know that all of these fields are required. They have set a default value for the contact me by, all right? And when you look, of course, the JavaScript is going to be more extensive, but it's built upon the first thing that we did, all right, the one we just looked at. Again, they're still only checking for the presence or absence of this stuff, all right? But now they're coming through here and they're saying this. If the length of the messages is 0, what does that mean? Well, messages is an empty array. See that? And if it finds an error with the email, that's going to add that line. If it finds an error with the phone, that line, with the country, with the service. But it's putting all of them together and it's saying, hey, if it's equal to 0, you haven't found any errors, so submit it. Otherwise, we're displaying the error messages. So the big difference, the big change or takeaway here is rather than showing things on the side, it's showing it up above. All right? The reset form is pretty much the same, and the event listeners that are in here are pretty much the same. All right. So that's it. Hopefully, like I said, going over the other one first helped. Now remember, the other thing too is, let's say, okay, Jeff, I'll tell you what, I went through the W3 schools one again, I went through the chapter, and guess what? I'm still totally screwed up. All right? Well, I believe even these exercises at the end of the chapter, I believe you're given the answers to those. So you can go back and take a look at that stuff, because you've got it in your myriad of stuff that you were given at the beginning of the semester, and look at it. And sometimes the best way to learn, I've done this before, is take all the stuff that they give you, put it into another file, and see if you can reproduce it yourself. All right? So, last thing then. Tomorrow, shorter chapter. Another one, 14 pages long. It won't take long. I do it today, but you all look burned out, and I feel burned out. All right? So it probably won't take much time. Since now we're all here, I'm going to look for that midterm, and if I find it right now, I will send you both I will print you out a hard copy and send you an electronic copy. All right? Yesterday, Michael had asked about this. I sent you your schedule for the rest of this week and for next week, just so you know. All right? By next week, I should be able to send you the schedule for the following week. All right? I don't mind giving it to you a week in advance. We had a teacher here for a couple years. He left last year, Paul Knott, and Paul's a terrific guy and was a great teacher. Every time he made a change on his syllabus, he updated his syllabus. It was always correct. I marveled that he had the time to do that. All right? I just don't. So I try to let you know every day, you know, and as always, if it's tomorrow and you got a question, something we went over today, then ask. All right? I should remember to say all the time, hey, does anybody have any questions? I usually don't remember that. All right? So we will go over this tomorrow. We will go over what you have to do for the midterm tomorrow, and we will go over the test tomorrow. All right? We will do all three of those. And still, considering this is a short chapter, I would guess by no later than 10 at the most, maybe even earlier than that, the rest of the period will be lab. And as I think I already said to you, this is the thing I emailed you, wherever the heck it is. There. So, we are now here. We just went over Chapter 6, tomorrow Chapter 7, and as it says, pass out and discuss the midterm. Next Monday and Tuesday will be lab for the entire period. So if you're behind, hopefully that gives you a chance to catch up. This stuff for 5, 6, and 7 is not due until 2 weeks from tomorrow. So you should have plenty of time to work on it. All right? Questions? All right. That's all I've got for today then for lecture.